Hello, and welcome to Mind Sherlock, where every story feels like a conversation over a warm cup of coffee. Today, I bring you a brand new Sherlock Holmes mystery, filled with twists, clues, and clever deductions. Make yourself comfortable, and let's unravel the case together. And if you'd like, leave a quick comment and tell me where you're joining from. It's always a pleasure to know where our little detective community is tuning in from. Now, let's get started. It was upon the evening of the 10th of October, in the year 1897, when the singular case of the Blood Moon conspiracy first cast its shadow upon our quiet Baker Street existence. The hour was 10:30, and the gas lamps along the thoroughfare flickered feebly, their light all but swallowed by a peculiar crimson glow that bathed the streets in a spectral hue. The moon, heavy and low, hung like a great blood-orange lantern in the sky, a sight so unsettling that even the passing hansoms seemed to rattle more loudly upon the cobblestones. I stood at the window, my brandy untouched, watching the strange light paint the curtains a dull shade of rust. Behind me, Sherlock Holmes sat motionless in his armchair, the tendrils of his pipe smoke curling upward as if drawn toward the unnatural sky. There was a peculiar quality to Holmes that evening, a certain stillness that betrayed a mind far from idle. His fingers tapped absently upon the arm of his chair, yet his eyes were half closed, their focus turned inward. Though accustomed to his fits of abstracted thought, I sensed this was of a different order. A tension coiled beneath his usual detachment. It was as though some invisible thread bound him to the world beyond our window, where the blood-red moon loomed like an ancient omen. I had seen Holmes in many moods, but this was a shade unfamiliar even to me. At precisely 11 o'clock, the silence was broken by a sharp, hurried knocking upon our door. 3 urgent raps, followed by a brief pause, and then a fourth, louder than the rest. Holmes opened his eyes fully at once. "Ah," he said, with the air of a man whose expectation has ripened into certainty. "It would appear, Watson, that the night is about to earn its colour." Before I could form a reply, Mrs. Hudson's voice floated up the stairs, announcing a visitor who would not give her name, but insisted that her errand was of the utmost urgency. The door swung open, and there upon the threshold stood a woman swathed in a heavy velvet cloak, its hood drawn low over her face. Though the cloak itself was immaculate, her hands, which clutched the edges of the fabric, trembled visibly, pale fingers twitching like leaves caught in an unfriendly wind. She took a single hesitant step into the room, then another, as if fearful that the very air might betray her presence. Not a word escaped her lips, and yet the silence she carried with her spoke louder than any plea could have done. Holmes gestured silently toward the hearth. For a full minute, Holmes said nothing. His eyes, however, took inventory of the visitor with a precision that was almost surgical. From the frayed stitching at the hem of her cloak to the fine sheen of moisture upon her gloves, every detail passed under his scrutiny like evidence upon a magistrate's bench. At last he rose, not to offer a seat or a word of welcome, but to cross to the window where the blood moon still held dominion over the sky. "Interesting," he murmured, his back still to us. "It appears, Watson, that tonight's guest brings both fear and weather in her wake." Even then, I sensed that this case would be unlike any other I had chronicled. A strange mingling of science and superstition, of cold logic and ancient dread. Holmes had always stood firm upon the rock of reason, but for the first time I wondered if the tide might reach him. The trembling fingers reached up, pushing back the heavy velvet hood, and at last the pale and drawn face of our visitor was revealed. She could not have been more than 26, yet her countenance bore the unmistakable marks of prolonged strain, as though fear had carved fine lines upon her brow before their time. "It is Lady Clarissa Dunsforth," said Holmes, before she had uttered a word. "Daughter of the late Sir Peregrine Dunsforth, if my memory serves, once Astronomer Royal, until a regrettable incident stripped him of both title and reputation. Clarissa gave a start. How could you possibly know? But Holmes merely waved his hand, as if such trivial deductions were hardly worth the breath required to explain them. Pray, be seated, Lady Clarissa. You have braved the hour and the streets alone, which suggests your errand admits no delay. She drew forth a small pocket handkerchief, twisting it nervously between her hands as she spoke. I do not know how much you remember of my father's fall from grace, she began, her voice scarcely above a whisper. But before he was ruined, he made one final prediction, a dire warning concerning the blood moon. An astronomical curiosity, nothing more, said Holmes. For most, yes, Clarissa agreed. But my father believed it was more than that this particular blood moon would herald both celestial wonder and earthly horror. He spoke of ancient rituals, crimes tied to the alignment of the heavens, patterns of violence that repeated across generations. Watson, unable to hide his skepticism, said gently, Surely such notions are the work of a mind made fevered by obsession. I thought so too, Clarissa admitted, until I received this. From within her cloak, she produced a folded letter, the paper thin and brittle with age, the ink faded but unmistakably legible. Holmes took it, holding it by the edges as though it might disintegrate under too firm a grip. The message was brief, its tone chillingly direct. The blood moon rises once more. What your father saw must remain buried, lest the heavens demand their due. There was no signature, only a crude sketch of the moon partially eclipsed by a shadowy hand. When did this arrive? Holmes asked. 2 days ago, Clarissa said, and since then, my father has vanished without trace. Holmes said nothing at first. His gaze swept over her. The mud caked upon the hem of her gown, the faint stain of ink on her right index finger, the unnatural angle of her left foot, as though favouring an old injury. A curious sequence of events, Lady Clarissa, he said at last, and one which, I fear, you have not related in full. She coloured slightly, but said nothing. Holmes turned to me, his expression faintly amused. You see, Watson, we are never presented with a case, only with its outermost shell. Holmes folded the letter with care and placed it upon the mantelpiece. You visited your father's observatory tonight, he said abruptly. Clarissa's mouth opened in astonishment. How? The mud on your gown is of a peculiar greyish hue, found only in the marshlands adjoining the old Dunsforth Observatory. The ink on your fingers speaks to recent handling of astronomical charts, and your limp— that tells its own story, does it not? She nodded reluctantly. I thought I might find some clue there, some trace of what my father was pursuing. But the observatory was in disarray, papers scattered everywhere. I grew frightened and fled. It was Holmes who provided the remainder of the tale, with Clarissa nodding faintly at each point of his recital. Sir Peregrine Dunsforth was once a man of formidable intellect and unassailable reputation, Holmes said, until in the autumn of 1892 he published a paper claiming that celestial alignments directly influenced criminal behaviour. The scientific community, understandably, ridiculed him. His work was discredited, his name reduced to a cautionary tale. He withdrew entirely, Clarissa added, rarely leaving the observatory, speaking only of the Lunar Society, a secretive group who shared his belief in the link between the heavens and human fate. And now, said Holmes, that past has returned to collect its debt. There is one more thing, Clarissa said hesitantly. My father confided in me only once that he had discovered something so extraordinary he dared not publish it. What sort of discovery? Asked Holmes. Clarissa shook her head. He never said, only that it was tied to the blood moon, and that if revealed, it could shake the very foundations of science and reason. Holmes leaned back, fingers steepled. It is a curious fact, Watson, that those who stumble upon revolutionary truths are rarely allowed to enjoy them for long. The world prefers its comfortable ignorance. Clarissa's eyes filled with sudden tears. I fear my father's truth has cost him his life. Holmes rose abruptly and crossed to the window, where the blood moon still hung, large and sullen in the sky. Celestial mischief and terrestrial malice, he said softly. A rare cocktail indeed. Watson, sensing his old friend's rare flicker of uncertainty, said, "You are not suggesting that some supernatural force is at work?" Holmes turned, his face sharp with amusement. "My dear Watson, you do me a disservice. If there is one principle to which I cling, it is that there is no ghost so frightful as a man with a secret." "And yet," I said, "you seem uncharacteristically uneasy." Holmes's smile faded slightly. "Because, Watson, I suspect this case will not merely test our wits, it will test the very boundary between reason and fear." Clarissa's footsteps had scarcely faded when I turned to Holmes. "You are certain this is merely a case of earthly crime?" I asked. Holmes did not immediately reply. Instead, he relit his pipe, sending a thin stream of smoke curling toward the blood-red sky. "There is no limit," he said at last, "to the tricks a clever man may play upon the mind. But sometimes, Watson, just sometimes, I wonder if the cleverest trick of all is the one we play upon ourselves." That cryptic remark haunted me long after the fire had died to embers. Holmes set a relentless pace as we crossed the damp fields toward the Dunsforth Observatory. The blood moon, though lower now, still bathed the landscape in its eerie glow. The mist clung low to the ground, swirling about our ankles like some living thing reluctant to let us pass. "An observatory," Holmes remarked as we trudged through the mire, "is a curious temple for both science and superstition, is it not, Watson? A shrine to reason, haunted by ancient fears." He spoke little more until the dark silhouette of the observatory loomed before us, its dome a broken crown upon the night sky. The building had once stood proudly as a monument to Sir Peregrine's brilliance, but time and scandal had reduced it to this, a forgotten relic shrouded in silence and decay. Holmes paused only briefly before mounting the stone steps, his keen eyes already searching for the first trace of disturbance. It took Holmes no more than a moment to detect that we were not the first to disturb this lonely ruin. His lantern swept across the ground, illuminating fresh scuff marks on the weathered stone. "You observe, Watson," said he, pointing to the shallow grooves in the earth, "that these tracks are recent, no more than 12 hours old. The mud is still damp, and the imprint suggests a man of considerable weight." I bent to examine the marks, but Holmes had already moved on. Near the threshold lay a stub of candle, its wick blackened but not wholly consumed. "A hasty retreat," he mused. "Whoever came here had little interest in ceremony. They lit their way only briefly, abandoning caution in their eagerness." I asked Holmes who he believed the visitor to be, but he merely smiled, that infuriating smile that signaled a deduction he was not yet prepared to share. Inside the observatory, the disorder was almost theatrical in its intensity. Charts, papers, and journals lay strewn across the floor like fallen leaves. Some crumpled underfoot, others pierced through with compass needles or weighted down by broken instruments. Holmes moved among the wreckage with the air of a man surveying an ancient battlefield. He knelt to retrieve a torn fragment of a star chart, holding it delicately between his fingers. "Be so good as to observe," said he, "the annotations along the margins. They are written in a trembling hand, and they all concern the lunar cycle, particularly the blood moon." I bent to read the faded ink, and though I understood little of the astronomical calculations, the phrase repeated throughout was impossible to miss. Lunar convergence and the fatal hour. "It seems," I said, "that Sir Peregrine's obsessions persisted to the last." "Or," Holmes replied softly, "someone wished us to believe so." Near the base of the great telescope, half buried beneath shattered glass, Holmes uncovered a curious fragment, a scrap of paper, its edges charred as though hurriedly thrust into a flame. He examined it under the lantern's glow, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Fascinating," he murmured. "The paper itself is of a peculiar make, a heavy vellum more suited to ceremonial documents than personal correspondence." I peered over his shoulder and could make out only a few surviving words. Meeting of the Lunar Society. Blood moon in ascension. Consequences irreversible. "The Lunar Society," I exclaimed. That was the secret circle Sir Peregrine spoke of, the gathering of astronomers who dabbled in mysticism. "Precisely," said Holmes. "And if this document is genuine, it suggests that Sir Peregrine was not the only one who still believed in the Society's dark purpose. Someone went to considerable trouble to destroy this evidence. And yet, here it is." As Holmes pocketed the fragment, I struggled to piece together what little I knew of the infamous Lunar Society. "I recall some mention of them in the papers years ago," I said. "Weren't they little more than an eccentric club of stargazers?" Holmes gave a short laugh. "The official accounts painted them as such, yes, but privately they fancied themselves heirs to ancient astrologers, men who believed the heavens governed not only tides and harvests, but the very impulses of the human heart." He paused to relight his pipe. "Some claimed to predict crimes before they occurred. Others believed certain celestial alignments could compel ordinary men to commit extraordinary acts." "Superstitious nonsense," I muttered. "Indeed," said Holmes. "And yet, here we are, surrounded by the wreckage of reason, all in the shadow of a crimson moon." Holmes's lantern swept across the observatory floor once more, illuminating not only the papers and broken instruments, but something more subtle, a delicate line of ash along the eastern windowsill. He knelt, pinching a few grains between his fingers. "Curious," he murmured. "This is no ordinary ash. Observe the fine texture. This comes from a Trichinopoly cigar." "Hardly damning evidence," I remarked. "Plenty of men smoke Trichinopoly." "Fewer than you think," Holmes replied. "It is not a fashionable choice, Watson, particularly among English gentlemen. It is, however, favoured by one man of our acquaintance." "And who is that?" "Professor Linwood," Holmes said with a smile. "Once Sir Peregrine's fiercest rival. And, unless I am much mistaken, our midnight visitor." We had scarcely left the observatory when we encountered the old groundskeeper, a weather-beaten man with a face like crumpled parchment, who had served the Dunsforth estate for over 30 years. Holmes, with his usual ease, drew the man into conversation, extracting with remarkable speed the confirmation we sought. "Oh, aye," the man said. "Professor Linwood was here just last night. Came alone, muttering about unfinished business. Didn't stay long, though, left in a terrible hurry." "And did he mention the blood moon?" Holmes asked. The old man crossed himself. "He said the moon was watching him." As the groundskeeper turned to leave, Holmes's gaze flicked to the man's sleeve, where a single coarse hair clung stubbornly to the fabric. "Your dog," said Holmes. "A Welsh terrier, I presume." The old man's mouth fell open. "How in blazes did you— You have his hair upon your cuff, and the scent of the kennel lingers faintly in your coat. A tidy creature, I'm sure, but a shade too curious for his own good." The man gaped, then laughed. "I'll be hanged, sir, but you've got the right of it." As we walked back toward Baker Street, Holmes sniffed the air and gave me a sidelong glance. "New cologne, Watson?" I flushed. "A gift from my wife's cousin. She insists I modernize." Holmes's smile was positively wicked. "Lavender and bergamot, an odd choice for a man of action." "Must you deduce everything?" I groaned. "Only what you fail to conceal," said Holmes. As we stood within the darkened dome, surrounded by the dishevelled remnants of Sir Peregrine's life work, Holmes delivered one of those spontaneous lectures that always left me feeling simultaneously enlightened and chastened. The Lunar Society, Watson, was no ordinary gathering of scientific minds. It was a curious hybrid, a fraternity of astronomers who, dissatisfied with the limits of known science, turned instead to the superstitions of the ancient world. They believed, quite literally, that the heavens dictated not only tides and crops, but also the very crimes men commit. Surely no rational man could subscribe to such folly, I protested. Holmes gave a faint smile. Rational men rarely join secret societies, my dear Watson. The attraction lies in the very irrationality, in the promise that the universe itself whispers its secrets to the select few willing to listen. Sir Peregrine listened and paid the price. Holmes's attention shifted abruptly from the scattered papers to the telescope itself, his gaze settling upon a slender ridge of ash resting on the polished brass base. Trichinopoly, he said softly, lifting a small pinch between his fingers. I'd come to recognize that name from previous cases, a particularly pungent brand of Indian cigar, unmistakable once encountered. You recall, Watson, Holmes continued, that Sir Peregrine himself detested tobacco in any form. Therefore, this belongs not to him, but to a visitor, and not just any visitor. There are, after all, only a select few connoisseurs who indulge in such a distinctive vice. Linwood, I said, the name escaping my lips almost involuntarily. Holmes's eyes sparkled with satisfaction. Precisely. Our dear Professor Linwood, that most relentless of rivals, has left his calling card in the form of combustion. The night grows more interesting with each passing moment. Outside the observatory, we encountered the groundskeeper, a stooped and weathered fellow whose natural suspicion gave way to eager gossip the moment Holmes addressed him with familiar authority. Strangers last night? Holmes asked casually, brushing imaginary dust from his coat sleeve. The man scratched his chin, then nodded vigorously. Aye, sir. There was a gent here, well dressed but in a terrible state. Kept looking over his shoulder, like he thought someone was following him. Said he needed to retrieve something the old man left behind. Holmes's expression remained impassive, but I knew this was precisely the confirmation he had expected. And did this visitor mention the moon? Holmes added. The groundskeeper's eyes widened. Said it was watching him, sir, clear as if it had eyes. Holmes thanked the man, slipping him a coin, and we took our leave, the web tightening with every step. As we walked, Holmes shared his deductions with the same quiet confidence with which he might describe the weather. Professor Linwood, said he, was Sir Peregrine's most vocal critic, dismissing his theories as unscientific lunacy before the Royal Astronomical Society. That public humiliation marked the beginning of Dunsforth's ruin. Yet Linwood came here, I mused. Why? Holmes gave a slight shrug. Therein lies our riddle. Linwood spent years discrediting Dunsforth. Why revisit the scene of his triumph? It suggests either guilt or fear. Either Linwood knew Dunsforth's theories were not so absurd after all, or he feared what Dunsforth had uncovered might ruin him in turn. I shook my head, daunted as ever by Holmes's capacity to construct an entire history from a few grains of evidence. Whether as rival or conspirator, Holmes concluded, Linwood is now firmly part of this tangled affair. As the groundskeeper retreated, Holmes's gaze dropped briefly to the man's sleeve, where a single coarse hair clung resolutely to the fabric. Your terrier, said Holmes, appears to be in robust health. The old man paused, blinking in confusion. My what, sir? Your dog, Holmes clarified. A Welsh terrier, to be precise, judging by the wiry hair on your sleeve, the faint smell of straw in your cuffs, and the tendency of such animals to follow their masters far too closely. The man stared in astonishment. Well, I'll be... How did you know? Holmes made no reply, only offering the faintest flicker of amusement as we resumed our walk. To this day, I remain convinced that Holmes's greatest pleasure was not solving mysteries, but unsettling the minds of ordinary men by solving the small puzzles of their lives without so much as an invitation. We had scarcely walked 50 yards when Holmes sniffed the air and gave me a sidelong glance. New cologne, Watson? I sighed, bracing for the inevitable. A gift from Mary's cousin, I admitted. She insists I must keep pace with modern sensibilities. Holmes raised an eyebrow. Bergamot and lavender. A curious combination, somewhat indecisive, as if it cannot quite determine whether it wishes to be floral or medicinal. Must you deduce everything? I grumbled. It is hardly deduction when the evidence arrives so freely. Though mildly irritated, I could not help but smile. Holmes, I knew, would never change. As we reached the road, Holmes's expression grew uncharacteristically pensive. Tell me, Watson, he said, what does our Professor Linwood strike you as? A conspirator or a victim? I considered this in silence. He seems too timid for a villain, but too desperate for an innocent. Precisely my difficulty, said Holmes, which is why we must proceed on the assumption that he could be either. Or both, I suggested. Holmes smiled faintly. Let us hope for his sake it is only one. The blood moon, I fear, is rarely so forgiving. With that ominous remark, we turned back toward Baker Street. Holmes sat in his chair, Dunsforth's journals spread across his knees, his brow furrowed in deep concentration. The pages were brittle and faded, inked with frantic handwriting that grew increasingly erratic as the entries progressed. Remarkable, Holmes muttered, almost to himself. Dunsforth's fear was not for his own life, but for the enactment of a prophecy not of natural consequence, but of deliberate, premeditated ritual. I leaned closer to see the words that had so captured his attention. Dunsforth spoke not of random violence, but of a murder foretold, timed with meticulous precision to coincide with the rising of the blood moon. A ritual murder, Holmes said softly. A performance designed not merely to kill, but to complete some ancient belief, to bind crime and cosmos together in one theatrical act. But who would believe such nonsense? I asked. Holmes's expression was grim. A man who has spent his life trying to disprove it, until the truth frightened him more than the ridicule. The notes spoke obsessively of ancient sects who viewed the moon not as a passive observer of earthly affairs, but as an active participant, a celestial witness that required blood to mark its passage. Certain crimes, committed under precise lunar alignments, were believed to alter fate itself. A death under the blood moon could sever old curses or awaken long-dormant forces. Pure medieval superstition, I said, unable to mask my incredulity. Indeed, Holmes agreed, but superstition is a powerful tool in the hands of a clever man. Imagine a mind like Linwood's, trained in science, but secretly fascinated by the occult. Such a mind, once confronted with the uncanny precision of Dunsforth's prediction, might find itself caught between reason and fear. Holmes's fingers drummed lightly upon the table. And if that mind feared exposure, if it believed its own life hung upon fulfilling the prophecy, he might kill to complete it, I finished. Holmes rose suddenly, retrieving Clarissa's threatening letter from the mantelpiece. He held it alongside a page torn from Dunsforth's notes. Observe, Watson, he said. The slope of the letters, the peculiar loop in the capital L, the tremor evident in the descending strokes. This hand, the hand that threatened Clarissa, is the same that penned these annotations. Dunsforth? I asked, bewildered. No, Holmes replied. Linwood. I stared in disbelief. But Linwood denounced Dunsforth, publicly humiliated him. Precisely why Linwood would have the greatest reason to fear Dunsforth's final discovery, said Holmes. If Dunsforth had found evidence that supported his so-called lunacy, then Linwood's career, built upon discrediting him, would collapse like a house of cards. So Linwood threatened Clarissa to silence her father, or to draw attention away from his own involvement, Holmes said. But even the cleverest of men leave fingerprints upon their crimes. Holmes had scarcely finished his pronouncement when the distant clang of church bells rang out over Baker Street. He glanced at the clock. Midnight. Too late, he said quietly. A messenger arrived at the door moments later, breathless and pale. A body's been found, sir. In Hampstead Heath. Under the blood moon. We arrived at the scene to find Professor Linwood stretched out upon the grass, his throat cut cleanly from ear to ear, his sightless eyes locked upon the crimson sky above. His arms were arranged carefully at his sides, fingers pointed toward the heavens, as though inviting the moon to bear witness to his fate. "Dear God," I whispered. Holmes bent low, examining the wound. "A professional hand," he said. "This was no crime of passion. This was the fulfillment of the prophecy, staged like a macabre work of theatre." "But if Linwood is dead," I said, "then who?" Holmes straightened, his expression colder than I had ever seen it. "That, my dear Watson, is the true author of this drama. The one who cast Linwood not as villain, but as victim." We stood for some minutes in silence, gazing down at the professor's lifeless form. The arrangement of the body was unmistakable, an echo of the very diagrams Holmes had shown me in Dunsforth's notes, where ancient sects prepared their sacrifices beneath the moon. "Linwood did not fear the prophecy," Holmes said at last. "He believed in it." I shook my head. "But why would a man of science—" "Because belief is not confined to the ignorant," Holmes interrupted. "In fact, the most dangerous believers are often those who once held themselves superior to belief. When faced with something they cannot explain, they become its most devout disciples." He nudged a scrap of paper beside the body with the toe of his boot, a torn page from Dunsforth's journal. Upon it, in Linwood's own hand, was scrawled a single line: "The moon demands its witness." Holmes's face was unreadable. He came here to enact the ritual himself, or so he thought. Instead, someone ensured that he would play the role of the sacrifice. As the constables covered the body and began their grim work, Holmes lit a cigarette, his gaze fixed upon the sky. "Linwood was no criminal mastermind," he said softly. "He was a puppet, dancing to strings pulled by a far more skillful hand." "Clarissa?" I asked, though even as I said it, I knew it could not be so. "No," said Holmes. "Clarissa was bait, a lure designed to summon Linwood into the open. The true hand behind this affair needed Linwood dead, but wished to hide that death within the folds of the prophecy. But who would have the knowledge and the malice to stage such a thing?" Holmes smiled faintly. "The same man who once stood beside Sir Peregrine and Linwood, gazing up at the same stars. A man who believes that prophecy is not prediction, but instruction." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. "You mean someone within the Lunar Society itself?" "Exactly so," said Holmes. "A man who knows that the surest way to ensure a prophecy comes true is to fulfill it yourself." Holmes's mind was already racing ahead, his deductions assembling like clockwork gears. "This hidden player," he continued, "needed Linwood afraid enough to act out the ritual in a desperate attempt to control his own fate. But fear alone was not sufficient. Linwood needed to believe the prophecy was already unfolding, so the threats to Clarissa were not intended to harm her, but to draw Linwood back to the observatory," Holmes confirmed. He had to believe Dunsforth's discovery was at risk of exposure. Once Linwood was within reach, the third hand stepped in and ensured that Linwood would fulfill the prophecy with his own blood. I struggled to keep pace with Holmes's relentless logic. "But who is this third hand?" Holmes's smile was thin. "That, Watson, is the final piece of our puzzle, and by dawn I intend to name him." Holmes knelt beside the body, his fingers moving deftly over the late Professor Linwood's lifeless form. There was nothing hurried in his examination, rather a kind of solemn precision, as though he were cataloguing some grim archaeological relic. "Every detail," Holmes murmured, "mirrors the rites described in Dunsforth's notes. Observe the posture, the arms raised as if in invocation, the throat cut with surgical exactitude, the eyes left deliberately open to the sky." I shuddered. "You mean this was no spontaneous crime? It was staged?" "Staged," Holmes confirmed, "with scholarly fidelity to ritual. The killer did not merely desire Linwood's death. He wished to consecrate it." I glanced around the darkened heath. the blood moon glaring down like some ancient deity awakened to claim its offering. "This is not science," I muttered. "This is madness." Holmes gave the barest of smiles. "The line between the two, my dear Watson, is thinner than you imagine, and it has been crossed." We walked some distance from the scene before Holmes spoke again. His hands were clasped behind his back, his steps slow and deliberate. "Linwood was a man of reason, but reason decayed under fear," he said. "He allowed superstition to unseat logic, and in so doing, he became the perfect pawn." "Pawn to whom?" I asked. Holmes gave a slight shrug. "To the mind that orchestrated this entire performance. Consider, Linwood had the knowledge of the rituals, the professional rivalry with Dunsforth, and a very public reason to wish him discredited or silenced. Who better to manipulate?" "But why kill Linwood?" I pressed. "Because even the best pawns are expendable once their role is played." It was a chilling thought, that a man could be so thoroughly used, his fears amplified until they consumed him, only to be discarded like a broken tool. Holmes's gaze returned to the sky. "There is another hand in this, Watson, a colder, cleverer hand, one that believes the stars themselves can be made accomplices." As we descended from the heath, Holmes fell into the peculiar silence I had come to associate with the most dangerous moments of our cases. It was a silence not of contemplation, but of certainty, the silence of a man who had glimpsed the shape of the enemy, even if the face remained obscured. "This third player," Holmes said at last, "is not bound by fear or superstition. He is neither victim nor believer. He is a manipulator, a man who understands that fear itself can be used as a scalpel." "You speak as if you know him," I said cautiously. "I know his type," Holmes corrected, "the academic who strays too far from scholarship into performance, the mind that delights not merely in solving puzzles, but in creating them, at the cost of human life." The image sent a cold shiver through me. "And this man, you believe he's still watching us?" Holmes nodded. "He does not fear exposure. To him, we are part of the game, and until the final move is played, he will not step from the shadows." Back at Baker Street, Holmes' restless energy found temporary respite in the ordered ritual of pipe and fireplace. I knew better than to press him, for he was building something in his mind, a scaffold upon which the truth might hang. "We must set a snare," Holmes said at last, "but it must be woven from the very fabric of the crime itself." "A trap?" I asked. "For whom?" "For the mind behind the curtain," Holmes replied. "A man who believes himself unseen, who trusts in the fear he has carefully cultivated. To catch such a man, we must show him exactly what he expects to see, a revelation so tempting, so irresistible, that he will expose himself to claim it." "And what revelation is that?" Holmes smiled faintly. "Ah, Watson, must I spoil the pleasure so soon? Let us say only that the stars have not spoken their final word, and our friend will soon believe they have whispered his name." I groaned audibly. "As always, I am to be kept in the dark." "Not at all," said Holmes. "You are to be the light that draws him in." That final remark, though spoken lightly, troubled me more than I cared to admit. Holmes's brilliance had always inspired a sense of awe in me, but there were times when his absolute confidence bordered too closely upon recklessness. "You believe we are dealing with a man capable of murder," I said. "A man who has already staged one ritual killing and will not hesitate to stage another if it suits his purpose." "Correct," said Holmes. "And your solution is to bait him with a forgery, a lie built upon the very fears he has spent years cultivating." "Correct again. And I added, am to be the one standing beside you when this trap is sprung." Holmes's smile was maddeningly serene. "You have always been an indispensable companion, Watson." I said nothing further, but inwardly a chill had settled over me that no fire could dispel. I had stood beside Holmes in dark alleys, in opium dens, and in the halls of the mighty. But this was different. This case did not merely threaten life and limb, It threatened the very foundation of reality upon which Holmes had built his world. And for the first time, I feared it might crack beneath his feet. Holmes set to work with a precision I had seen him apply to forgery only once before, a case so infamous I dare not name it even now. His tools were modest: a pen sharpened to surgical delicacy, a bottle of ink prepared to match the faded viscosity of Dunsforth's original notes, and a sheet of paper so aged and foxed it might easily have lain in the observatory for decades. "What precisely are you writing?" I asked, though I knew I would receive no full answer. "Merely a scrap of history," Holmes replied. "A letter from Sir Peregrine to an unnamed confidant, describing a discovery so profound, so dangerous, that he dared not consign it to publication." The wording was carefully ambiguous, the references veiled just enough to imply that within the observatory's walls lay some celestial truth worth killing for. "Falsehood," I ventured. "An imaginative reconstruction," Holmes corrected me. "Truth is a scalpel, Watson, but now and then a clever forgery serves as a mirror, reflecting the face of the guilty." The document complete, Holmes entrusted it to hands both unsavory and indispensable: his network of informants who operated in the murky currents beneath London's polite society. "A whisper placed upon the right ear," Holmes explained, "can travel farther and faster than a royal decree." Within hours, the forged letter, or rather, the rumour of its existence, had crossed taverns, back alleys, and private parlours until it landed precisely where Holmes intended, within the hearing of Sir Alistair Chancery, a name which sent a shiver of recognition through me. "Surely not that Sir Alistair?" I asked, recalling a series of hushed scandals surrounding the eccentric antiquarian and his obsession with forbidden histories. "The very same," Holmes confirmed, "a man whose interest in the Lunar Society did not end with its collapse, but deepened into private ritual. Sir Alistair believes himself custodian of ancient truths, and he will not resist the bait we have placed before him." Holmes smiled thinly. "Before the night is over, Watson, the blood moon will draw him like a moth to the flame." As the hour approached, I found my discomfort rising to the surface. Holmes had spun many webs in our years together, but there was something about this one, the blending of forgery, manipulation, and occult suggestion, that left an ill taste in my mouth. "This is deception of the highest order," I said. "You are not merely exposing a criminal, you are feeding his delusion." Holmes, unmoved, inspected the chamber of his revolver. "A spider must spin a web to catch a fly, Watson. Do you expect me to stand on the heath and shout his name into the night? But to prey upon madness itself, is that not dangerous?" Holmes paused, his expression momentarily unreadable. "Dangerous, yes, but necessary. The mind that believes itself master of ancient prophecy is a mind that must be exposed with its own tools. To defeat him, we must allow him to think the stars themselves conspire against him." I had no reply. Logic, as ever, stood upon his side, and yet some shadow of unease clung to me as we donned our coats and stepped once more into the moonlit night. The observatory stood before us like a mausoleum, the great dome a skullcap beneath the crimson sky. Each footstep rang unnaturally loud against the stone floor, and I could not suppress a shiver as we entered once more into the chamber, where Dunsforth's mind had collapsed beneath the weight of his own obsession. Holmes moved without hesitation, selecting a corner from which both door and telescope were visible, the hunter positioning himself within his own snare. I took up position beside him, revolver heavy in my coat pocket, though I had little faith that mere bullets could dispel the atmosphere that clung to that place. The minutes dragged, the silence broken only by the distant cry of an owl and the ticking of Holmes's pocket watch. "You are certain he will come?" I whispered. Holmes gave a faint smile. Certain, no. Confident, beyond doubt. And so we waited, beneath the blood moon, while the past and present seemed to blur into one. And the final player, summoned by Holmes's deception, prepared to step onto the stage. It was nearly midnight when we heard it. Footsteps, cautious but determined, echoing up the stone steps outside. Holmes's eyes glinted in the dim light. "He comes," he whispered. The door creaked open, and Sir Alister Chancery stepped into view. Time had not been kind to him. His once regal bearing was stooped, his hair thin and wild, and his hands, they trembled with either age or excitement. In his grasp was a small lantern, the flickering light casting spectral shadows against the walls. He paused, sniffing the air like a man tracking prey, then moved toward the telescope. Holmes gave no signal, merely the faintest inclination of his head, and I stepped forward, revolver raised. "Sir Alister," I said, my voice unnaturally loud in the silence, "we have been expecting you." The old man did not startle. Instead, he smiled, a ghastly, toothless grin. "Of course you have," he said softly. "The stars foretold it." Holmes emerged from the shadows with his characteristic calm, his hands folded behind his back. "You have travelled a long road, Sir Alister, from scholar to prophet to murderer." "Murderer?" The old man's smile did not waver. "I have killed no one, Mr. Holmes. I have merely completed the cycle. What was foretold must come to pass." "Linwood?" I demanded. "You lured him here. You slit his throat beneath this very sky." "Linwood was weak," Sir Alister said, almost pityingly. "He tried to deny the stars, but they claimed him all the same." Holmes's voice cut through the madness like a scalpel. "And Dunsforth?" "His disappearance, his ruin, that too was your hand." "The prophecy demanded sacrifice," Sir Alister said. "As it always has." Holmes shook his head. "You see, Watson? Even the most educated mind can become a prisoner to its own delusions, if the right key is turned." Holmes produced the forged letter, holding it up so that the lantern's light illuminated the false handwriting. "Sir Peregrine's final confession," Holmes said, "written on the eve of his disappearance." Sir Alister reached for it, hands trembling. "At last," he whispered, "the final piece." Holmes pulled it back. "First, a confession of your own." The old man's face contorted with fury, but before he could reply, Holmes spoke again. "It is over, Sir Alister. The stars have no voice tonight. Only Scotland Yard." For a moment, the old man stood perfectly still. Then, with a strength I would not have believed possible, he lunged toward the open window, the blood moon bathing his face in crimson light. Holmes leapt after him, but too late. Sir Alister hurled himself from the window, his final words echoing in the night. "The stars! The stars demand it!" The hour crept toward midnight, and the air itself seemed to tighten as Holmes and I waited within the ruined dome of the Dunsforth Observatory. The blood moon hung low, its eerie crimson hue bathing every surface in unearthly light. Even Holmes, who held no patience for the supernatural, stood unusually still, as if some unseen force had paused his ceaseless mind. At last, through the veil of mist outside, a figure appeared, cloaked and deliberate, moving with the measured pace of a man fulfilling destiny rather than committing mere trespass. "Sir Alister," Holmes murmured, the name falling from his lips like a diagnosis. The man stepped into the observatory, casting a long, spectral shadow across the floor. His hands trembled, though whether from age or excitement, I could not tell. What struck me most was his expression, eyes wide with rapture, like some ancient priest summoned to bear witness to prophecy fulfilled. Holmes gave me a glance, calm, assured. But in the flickering light, I thought I saw something more. Not fear, certainly, but a rare glimmer of caution. The game, at last, had reached its final move. Sir Alister's gaze swept the room, settling at last upon the telescope, as though it were an altar to some celestial god. "They mocked us," he said, his voice trembling with fervour. "They called us charlatans, dreamers. But the stars, Holmes, the stars do not lie." Holmes folded his arms. "The stars are silent, Sir Alister. It is only desperate men who put words into their mouths. But the old man was unmoved. You think yourself apart from this, he continued. A mere observer, but you were always part of it. You, Sherlock Holmes, are the one foretold. The mind that would unravel the cosmic knot. The hand that would disrupt the dance of fate. It was absurd, the sort of wild-eyed prophecy fit for pulp pamphlets, not the cold rationalism of Baker Street. Yet there was something chilling in the certainty with which he spoke. Your logic is a cage, Holmes, Sir Alistair whispered, but the moon sees through it. Tonight, the prophecy demands its final player. Holmes's only reply was the faintest flicker of a smile. Not amusement, but the smile of a chess player watching his opponent's king approach its final square. Holmes stepped forward, his voice calm but cutting. Let us dispense with theatrics, Sir Alistair. You orchestrated Dunsforth's ruin, manipulated Linwood's fears, and now you stand here, hoping to crown your madness with one last performance. Performance? Alistair sneered. You think this is mere theatre? I think, said Holmes, that you are a man who spent too long peering at the sky until you mistook the reflection of your own madness for prophecy. You knew Dunsforth's theories would be ridiculed, but you also knew the power of belief. You twisted his daughter's fear, played upon Linwood's guilt, and staged a murder so elaborate it would appear predestined. And yet, Alistair said, eyes glinting with a disturbing light, here you stand, just as foretold. The great Sherlock Holmes beneath the blood moon, confronting the last of the Lunar Society. Do you truly believe you are here by choice? Holmes' expression did not change, but I saw his fingers tighten behind his back. The only sign that the madness had, if only for a moment, grazed the edges of his iron logic. You are no prophet, Holmes said coldly. You are a murderer with a flair for drama, and tonight, that drama ends. But Sir Alistair was not finished. His trembling hand gestured to the open sky above, the blood-red orb watching like an unblinking eye. You feel it, he said softly. Even you, Holmes, the weight of the sky pressing down upon us, the ancient rhythm, prophecy and blood, intellect and fate, all converging upon this single night. Holmes's voice was sharp. The only weight I feel is the burden of dismantling your absurd pageantry. Yet there was a pause before he spoke, a pause that unsettled me more than all Sir Alistair's ravings combined. This is no longer about Dunsforth nor Linwood, the old man said. This is about the prophecy's final piece, the sacrifice that will seal the cycle. And who, pray, Holmes said, is meant to be that sacrifice? Alistair's smile was answer enough. For the first time in our long acquaintance, I saw Holmes momentarily at a loss, not from fear, but from confronting a mind so unmoored from reality that logic itself became powerless. The blood moon demands its price, Alistair said, and tonight, the star's name, Sherlock Holmes. With alarming suddenness, Sir Alistair lunged toward Holmes, his fingers curling into claws. Holmes sidestepped easily, but the narrowness of the stairwell left little room to maneuver. I reached for my revolver, but Holmes waved me back. No, Watson, he said. This is no matter for bullets. The two men grappled, Holmes's calm precision against the desperate strength of a man driven beyond reason. Their struggle carried them up the spiral stairs toward the observation platform, their footsteps ringing in a terrible rhythm against the cold stone. For a moment, Alistair gained the upper hand, pressing Holmes perilously close to the open edge, where the railing had long since rusted away. I took a step forward, but Holmes's voice stopped me cold. Stay where you are, Watson. Even in the midst of chaos, his voice held absolute command. Yet I could hear strain beneath it, as though for the first time Holmes was not entirely certain of the outcome. With one final wrench, Holmes twisted free, but Alistair's momentum carried him forward, toward the gaping void at the stair's edge. For an instant he teetered there, the blood moon framing his wild silhouette. The stars will not be denied, he cried. And with that, he let go, his arms spread wide as if to embrace the crimson sky itself. He fell silently, his body vanishing into the mist below. Holmes exhaled softly, brushing dust from his sleeve. And thus ends the final act. I stood frozen, unable to reconcile the calm reality of Holmes beside me with the madness that had just unfolded. A man who lived by prophecy, Holmes said quietly, was, in the end, consumed by it. We stood for some time saying nothing, as the blood moon began to sink toward the horizon. Holmes's face was impassive, yet I, who knew him better than any man, saw the faint lines of something more. Not fear nor doubt, but a rare moment of recognition. "You were right," I said at last. "It was never about the stars. It was about the minds that stared into them." Holmes gave a rare smile, though it carried no humour. "Superstition, Watson, is the most enduring of human afflictions. It has slain more men than plague or war." "And yet," I said softly, "even you felt it, just for a moment." Holmes said nothing. As we turned toward home, I saw him glance once more at the fading moon. For all his brilliance, for all his mastery over fact and reason, Sherlock Holmes had stared into the abyss that night. And I wondered if, just for that moment, the abyss had stared back. We returned to Baker Street just as the first pale light of dawn filtered through the window. The crimson hue of the blood moon had faded, leaving only a pale and unremarkable sky, though its presence seemed to linger in my mind like the remnants of a disturbing dream. Holmes, for his part, betrayed no trace of the extraordinary events we had witnessed. He shed his coat, filled his pipe, and resumed his usual seat by the fire, as if we had merely returned from an evening stroll. "Is it truly over, Holmes?" I asked, though my mind was still clouded with uncertainties. "With Sir Alister's death, have we reached the end of this strange affair?" Holmes exhaled a thin stream of smoke, his gaze fixed upon some distant point. "The end, Watson? Number. Merely the final movement of a most elaborate performance." "And yet," I said, "there are so many points I still cannot piece together. The letter, the prophecy, Dunsforth's disgrace. How does it all connect?" Holmes gave me his faintest smile, the one that signalled he had been waiting for precisely this question. "Allow me, my dear Watson, to draw back the curtain." Holmes leaned back, steepling his fingers beneath his chin. From the moment Lady Clarissa stepped into this room, trembling beneath her cloak, the pattern was already discernible, if one knew where to look. "Her hands," he said, "trembling, yes, but stained faintly with ink. A woman who had not merely been searching for her father, but writing letters. Letters, I suspected, meant to invoke fear." "But the letter was sent to her," I protested. "You cannot mean—" "Patience, Watson." Holmes's smile was thin. "She was not the forger, but her father's disgrace was the chisel that shaped the crime. The letter itself bore the handwriting of Professor Linwood, whose association with Dunsforth had been a matter of bitter public record." "Linwood sent the letter?" "He believed himself acting independently, a warning born of paranoia. But Linwood was a pawn, not a player. The true hand belonged to Sir Alister. And why target Clarissa? Because fear breeds irrational action, Watson. Clarissa's desperation to recover her father made her vulnerable. She was, in essence, bait, a thread to draw us toward the stage Sir Alister had so carefully prepared. Consider, Watson," Holmes continued, "the blood moon itself, a simple, predictable phenomenon, neither rare nor supernatural. And yet, in the hands of a man like Sir Alister, it became an instrument of manipulation. Superstition, Holmes said, is the most pliable of tools. Sir Alister understood that even the most rational mind can be unsettled when the heavens themselves seem to conspire. Dunsforth, for all his eccentricity, was a man of science, but years of ridicule had left him fragile, and the blood moon became his obsession, a symbol of fate he could not escape. And Linwood? Linwood too was a rational man, until fear took root. Sir Alister fed that fear with letters, whispers, and careful manipulations. By the time the blood moon rose, Linwood was primed for tragedy. I shivered at the thought. A man's reason undone not by the stars, but by the careful hands of a mortal puppeteer. Holmes's voice softened slightly. Even the sharpest mind, Watson, can be blunted by fear, if the hand that holds it knows precisely where to press. I reached into my pocket, drawing forth the crumpled letter Clarissa had shown us on that first night. Its words still chilled me, despite Holmes's explanations. But the letter itself, I said, what purpose did it serve beyond frightening the girl? Holmes took it from my hand, examining it once more with the faintest trace of amusement. This letter, he said, is the ghost of Sir Peregrine Dunsforth, or at least, the ghost Sir Alistair wished us to believe in. He placed the letter upon the mantelpiece. It was designed to evoke all the old disgrace and scandal surrounding Dunsforth's fall, dredging up memories Clarissa could not ignore. Why not simply lure her to the observatory directly? Because, my dear Watson, fear is far more potent when the victim believes she is uncovering secrets by her own design. Had Sir Alistair summoned her openly, she might have resisted. But a letter, appearing as if from the ether, allows the imagination to supply the terrors. Such imagination is always more terrifying than fact. And Linwood's handwriting, copied expertly by Sir Alistair, the final cruel touch that ensured every thread in this web led directly to the blood moon. What puzzles me still, I said, is why Sir Alistair took such pains to resurrect a scandal long since buried. Dunsforth's reputation was already in ruin. What more could Sir Alistair gain? Holmes's smile faded. Reputation, Watson, was never the goal. Belief was. He leaned forward. Sir Alistair was no ordinary criminal. He was a man who believed himself the custodian of ancient truths. Truths so profound, they could reshape history if only the world could be made to listen. But to accomplish that, he needed an audience. And who better than the daughter of the man he had ruined? Her fear, her desperation, her willingness to believe. All of it served to rekindle the very obsession that had destroyed her father. In other words, I said slowly, he needed to create a believer, someone who would carry the flame forward after his death. Precisely. I shook my head in wonder. It was never about murder alone. It was about legacy, the legacy of madness. Holmes stood, stretching his long limbs before turning toward the window. Outside, dawn had chased away the last traces of crimson sky, leaving only the grey hush of London morning. You see, Watson, he said quietly, this was not a case of theft or blackmail, nor even revenge. This was the rarest of crimes, a crime of philosophy. Philosophy. Sir Alistair believed in fate, in prophecy, in celestial destiny, but belief alone was not enough. He needed proof, a performance so elaborate that even the skeptics would pause. He wished to convince you, I realized, that even you, the great Sherlock Holmes, could not escape the hand of fate. Holmes's smile returned, though it carried no warmth. A futile endeavour, of course, for fate, my dear Watson, is nothing more than a story men tell themselves when they cannot bear uncertainty. And yet, I said, there was a moment, when Sir Alistair spoke your name, I thought I saw you hesitate. Holmes's gaze drifted upward to the sky, now empty of stars. Perhaps, he said softly, but hesitation, Watson, is not belief. It is merely the mind reminding itself that even logic must occasionally blink. Holmes lit his pipe with a sense of quiet finality, the flickering match briefly illuminating the lean, ascetic planes of his face. A murder, he said at last, is a sordid thing, Watson. But a murder staged as prophecy, that is artistry of a most sinister stripe. I stared at him, unable to suppress a shiver. You mean Linwood's death was planned from the outset? Planned, rehearsed, and executed with the precision of a theatrical opening night, Holmes replied. Every detail, from the pose of the body to the direction in which the eyes were fixed, all carefully aligned with Dunsforth's so-called prophecy. But why? I demanded. Why go to such extremes? Because, my dear Watson, the mind seeks patterns. When confronted with chaos, it craves meaning, and nothing lends meaning to the meaningless like the illusion of destiny fulfilled. Sir Alistair understood that perfectly. He drew on his pipe. By killing Linwood in that precise manner, beneath the blood moon, he gave weight to Dunsforth's discredited beliefs, transforming mockery into apparent foresight. A man who dies by prophecy is not a victim, Watson. He becomes a symbol. I could not help but think of Lady Clarissa, her wide eyes brimming with fear, her trembling hands clutching that ominous letter. And Clarissa? I asked. What was she in all this? Holmes tapped the ash from his pipe with delicate precision. A pawn, Watson, and a most useful one. She was never intended as a victim herself. No, her role was subtler. Her arrival at Baker Street, her desperate plea, all of it was part of the stagecraft. Sir Alistair understood that you and I would be drawn in at once, and once ensnared, we would lend credibility to the entire charade. You mean we became part of the performance? Precisely. To the rational mind, prophecy is nonsense. But to a frightened girl, watched over by London's most famous detective, the very act of investigation imbued the prophecy with legitimacy. If Holmes himself took it seriously, how could she not? I felt a sudden pang of guilt, as though our very presence had deepened the girl's fears. Holmes saw it in my face. Blame no one, Watson, save Sir Alistair. Fear is a tool, and she was a canvas upon which he painted his masterpiece of terror. Holmes leaned back, smoke curling upward into the dim air. Fear, Watson, is the only true universal language. It speaks to the pauper and the prince, the scholar and the fool. But Dunsforth was a man of science, I objected. Surely he would not fall prey to such crude manipulation. Ah, but science offers no immunity to fear, especially when that fear wears the mask of science itself. Holmes's smile was sardonic. Dunsforth believed in his own prophecy precisely because it followed the language of charts and calculations. It allowed him to pretend that superstition was simply misunderstood science. And Linwood? Linwood feared something else entirely, the weight of guilt and history. He had destroyed Dunsforth's reputation, and in doing so, feared that he had tempted fate itself. When the blood moon rose and strange letters appeared, Linwood needed no ghost to haunt him. He became his own ghost. I shook my head. It was madness. Not madness, Watson. Fear, when placed in skilled hands, becomes indistinguishable from madness or prophecy. I could hold my silence no longer. You knew all this, Holmes, or suspected it at the very least, and yet you said nothing to me. Holmes's brows lifted. Would you have believed me, Watson, had I said on the first night that this was a murder orchestrated to resemble prophecy? Or would you, like all rational men, have dismissed the notion as absurd? I had no answer, for he was, as usual, correct. Besides, he continued, it is far more instructive to allow the mind to stumble once or twice before the truth is laid bare. A smooth path teaches nothing. You take a perverse delight in leaving me in the dark, I grumbled. Not at all, Holmes said, though his eyes twinkled. I merely believe that a story half told loses none of its pleasure. And really, Watson, where would the fun be if I explained everything at the start? My irritation lingered only a moment, eclipsed, as always, by admiration. No matter how often I watched his mind work, it never ceased to astonish me. Holmes rose and stretched, his movements languid, like a man who has completed some complex mathematical proof. You see, Watson, even detection must contain a measure of theatre. The mind, after all, hungers for story. And what is detection, if not the art of untangling narrative? You staged it deliberately, I said. Even your silences were part of the act. Every great magician knows that misdirection is half the trick, Holmes said. You focus the audience's gaze here. He gestured toward the window, while the true work happens there. You are infuriating, I muttered. And you, my dear Watson, are my perfect audience. The reasonable man confronted with unreasonable events. Despite myself, I smiled. You admit, then, that you need me? Holmes paused. I would not go so far, but every performance benefits from a willing spectator. It was the closest thing to sentiment I would receive, and from Holmes that was quite enough. Holmes returned to his chair, fingers steepled once more. Of course, he said, there are details I have omitted. Omitted? Some mysteries are more useful unsolved. A touch of the unknown keeps the mind limber. But consider it, Watson. Is it not more thrilling to wonder whether Sir Alistair truly believed, or whether he too played a role he did not quite believe in? Did he fall as a fanatic, or as a man who could no longer bear the weight of his own deception? I opened my mouth to argue, but found I could not. Holmes had placed the final mystery not in the stars, but in the heart of man himself. As the fire crackled and dawn broke across Baker Street, Holmes offered one last reflection. Fear, Watson, is the oldest accomplice in crime. It requires no payment, no persuasion, only the right conditions. And the blood moon provided them? Merely a stage light, Holmes said. The true accomplice was always within, the fear each man carried, waiting for the right moment to bloom. He tapped his fingers against the arm of his chair. In the end, it was not prophecy, nor fate, nor even the stars that dictated this tragedy. It was fear, simple, human fear, wrapped in the robes of destiny. He glanced at me with a rare smile. I wonder, Watson, what you fear most. But I did not answer, for at that moment I feared only that Holmes himself might one day find out. Night yielded to a waning glow as I stood beside Holmes at our Baker Street lodgings. Through the window, the blood moon's crimson radiance ebbed slowly into the encroaching London mist, its once fierce hue softening into a ghostly pallor. Holmes, ever the enigma, remained silent, his gaze fixed on the dissipating light with a blend of detached scrutiny and quiet contemplation. I felt a chill as the celestial display reminded me of that grim night, a spectral omen now fading into memory. In that fleeting moment, the extraordinary seemed to yield to the mundane, yet the weight of all we had witnessed lingered in the stillness. The blood moon, a harbinger of both dread and destiny, had receded, leaving behind a lingering sense of unresolved mystery and the promise of more revelations yet to come. Its final glow whispered secrets of the night, urging us onward into the unknown. Holmes turned from the window, his eyes reflecting a mind ever contemplating the unfathomable. For all the wonders of the skies, Watson, there remain mysteries far darker and stranger than the mere constellations, he observed in his characteristically measured tone. I listened as he mused over the nature of human ambition and the secrets concealed within every heart. The heavens, though vast and majestic, could not compare to the labyrinth of emotions and deceptions that men harbored. In his quiet way, Holmes implied that even the greatest scientific achievements pale beside the enigmatic depths of human nature. The stars are but silent witnesses to our failings and triumphs, he remarked, as if the cosmos itself held a mirror to our souls. His words resonated deeply within me, stirring thoughts of secrets yet unrevealed and truths waiting to be discovered. Indeed, the mysteries of the human heart surpassed even the endless wonder of the celestial expanse. As the final embers of our late-night deductions warmed the room, I retrieved a pair of brandies from the sideboard. Holmes accepted one with a nod, his face momentarily softening. A case of such intricate design and subtle manipulation deserves a fitting end, Watson, he said. I poured the amber liquid, watching it catch the light as though it held the secrets of the ages. Each sip was a reminder that no prophecy, no matter how ancient or cryptic, could have ever foretold the true genius that is Sherlock Holmes. In that quiet moment, as we clinked our glasses in silent acknowledgement, I felt both the gravity of our task and the inescapable pull of our next adventure. It was a simple ritual, yet one imbued with deep significance. The brandy, warm and potent, sealed our resolve and kindled the anticipation for the mysteries yet to unfold indeed. I must confess, despite my many frustrations, that Holmes remains an enigma. No matter how meticulously I track his deductions, his brilliance perpetually defies prediction. In every case, he unearths truths hidden beneath layers of deceit with an elegance that leaves me both humbled and exasperated. It is as if his mind operates on a plane far removed from ordinary thought, where every detail is a clue and every silence speaks volumes. I am left to marvel at his inexhaustible genius, even as I struggle to keep pace with his extraordinary intellect. His genius remains, beyond all mortal expectation indeed. As we prepared to close the chapter on this grim affair, Holmes offered a hint of the mysteries yet to be unravelled. With a sly smile he remarked, "There is talk of a missing violinist and whispers of a haunted mirror in the East End." His tone was light, almost teasing, as if the next case promised both peril and amusement in equal measure. I could only shake my head in resignation, knowing that with Holmes, adventure was never far behind. I suppose our next tale would be as enigmatic as this one. The future, indeed, remains eternally mysterious, unquestionably. Holmes leaned back in his armchair as the final embers of our case faded into the quiet of Baker Street. "You see, Watson," he began, his voice low and resolute, "the true mystery lies not in the theatrics of a staged murder, but in the subtle art of fear. How a man may be driven to fulfill a prophecy that is nothing more than the reflection of his own inner demons." I could only nod, silently acknowledging that even the most brilliant minds are sometimes ensnared by the dark allure of their hidden vulnerabilities. He paused, then added with a wry smile, "Perhaps the greatest deception was not that of the criminal, but of our own expectations. What, do you suppose, was his biggest mistake in manipulating both fate and fear?" I found myself compelled to ask this question not only aloud but also to you, dear reader. What do you think was the criminal's most glaring error in his elaborate web of deceit? If this mystery has sparked your curiosity, I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments below. Subscribe for more tales of intrigue and deduction, and do share this story with friends and family who, like us, revel in the timeless dance between reason and mystery. After all, in every shadow there lies a secret waiting to be discovered.